The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UW-M Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. In the U.S. and around the world, low-wage workers are asking for a raise. While current minimums vary widely between nations, from 28 cents per hour in India, for example, to over $16 per hour in Australia, arguments for and against raising the minimum wage vary little from place to place. Opponents characterize pay raises as job killers that slow economic growth. Advocates say higher wages increase consumer demand, spurring economy and increasing prosperity for all. Today, we'll explore the complex and often contentious questions around the ethics and economics of workplace compensation around the world. Here to help us are two seasoned practitioners of the dismal science who are well acquainted with the dynamics of workers and their wages. Scott Adams is an associate professor of economics at UW-M, where his teaching and research focus on health and labor economics. He also serves as Director of Graduate Studies and co-editor of the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. Abdur Chowdhury is Professor of Economics at Marquette University. He has also held numerous senior positions in international finance and global economic policy, including Chief Economist of the United Nations Commission in Europe. Well, welcome back, both of you.
Thank you.
Well, I wonder if we could just start with the basics. Now, there's a concept called market clearing wage. Now, could you explain what that is and why doesn't that prevail everywhere? The idea of, sort of supply and demand, the wages rise to what the market says they're worth.
Sure, I think that exists in every market, that you do have a wage that emerges. The question is whether or not that's a wage that we view as the efficient wage in the market and how competitive that market is. So if it is the competitive wage that's emerging, a government would be reluctant to intervene in that market. But if it's a wage that's emerging that's below what we might consider to be an efficient wage, which would happen, for example, if you had large companies who are exploiting workers, then there perhaps is a market failure in the room for government intervention. So an economic argument for imposing a minimum wage perhaps would be to deal with the excessive market power of some large companies. Most economists would believe if a market is operating in competitive fashion, if the government intervenes with a wage floor, that could potentially have distortionary effects on that market.
Yeah, I think if I can add to that, basically as we see the reality is in majority of the cases, we don't see market acting in a competitive fashion. So there the question of some sort of a floor does come into play.
So I think we've got a slide here that just compares some of the mandated minimums around the world. I don't know how clear it is, but you can see at the bottom, Sierra Leone's minimum wage is 3 cents an hour, and on the other end of the spectrum, we've got Australia at $16.88. So people would argue, yes, it looks like a huge gap between the two, but there's the concept of purchasing power parity, so that you don't need $16.80 an hour to live comfortably. To what extent does that mitigate that wild variation between wages, do you think?
I think there is some issue of purchasing power parity. Obviously, in Sierra Leone, you don't need $16 per hour. But even if you take the purchasing power parity into account, still you'll see there is a significant disparity across countries in terms of a minimum wage that workers get.
And what drives that?
Well, I think what we like to do when we think about how important a minimum wage is we compare it to the median wage, hourly wage that exists in the labor markets. And when you look at the United States in that chart, it seems pretty close to the top, but if you actually divide that by the median wage, the United States begins to look less favorably with their minimum wage compared to the rest of the world, also compared to the history of the minimum wage in the United States. Thus, one of the arguments we have now is we're thinking if we were able to provide a minimum wage that had a higher bite relative to the median wage back in the 1960s, and we had prosperity, why can't we also do that now? And that's part of the debate. We've fallen a bit behind in terms of where our minimum wage hits relative to the median wage.
So that begs the question, how is an acceptable minimum wage determined? I mean, what kinds of factors enter into that calculus?
You do take a lot of factors into consideration. You know, the cost of living, basically that's an important factor that comes into being the poverty level, basically where it is. That's also another factor that comes in. So there are a number of factors that you have to take into account before you decide what the minimum wage should be, the fair minimum wage should be.
The problem is in the United States, in relation to that, that's where we would love the minimum wage debate to perhaps rest, but in the United States, the minimum wage tends to be a political football, and it takes acts of Congress or acts of individual state legislatures who are trying to make some political point for the minimum wage to get raised. That's why we go decades without a change in the minimum wage, and then all of a sudden we have these incremental increases, and then we're back having these contentious debates. You know, in a lot of other countries, there's a much more centralized process whereby industrial organizations determine when and where those minimum wages are going to be raised. And I don't want to use the word efficient because in those countries the minimum wage is also necessarily inefficient, but creates a more equitable situation. But in the United States, the debate tends to be taken out of the the wage distribution and more put into a political debate, and it's framed in like an us versus them discussion and a left versus right discussion rather than what works best for the market at that time.
Yeah, I agree with Professor Adams on that. If you look at Australia, for example, the minimum wage basically increases every year based on a certain formula. Whereas in the United States, you know, after every couple of years, we have this political debate going on whether wage should increase or not, what effect it will have. So I think Australia has a much better system than we do over here.
So you referenced this a bit earlier, relative to the median wage, we've kind of lost ground. Can you talk a little bit about where we were, say, in the 60s and where we are now?
Yeah, I think in the 60s we were, you know, I guess the sweet spot is a lot of people would say you'd like the minimum wage to be somewhere in the 40% range of the median wage. Right now, the median wage in the U.S. is approaching $17, $18. So, at a minimum wage of $7 or $8, we're not near that point. So, in the past, we've been above 50% of the median wage, and some of the countries you put here are above 50% of the median wage. So we're quite a bit below. Really a place where the minimum wage would be expected to have much of an effect at all. If we were to increase the minimum wage by 25 cents next week, the effects would probably be minimal because we're so far away from that median wage. But the types of minimum wages that are being discussed recently, from $7-something to $15, will put us, you know, not only above 50% of the median wage, but closer to 75-80% of the median wage. There was really starting to hit territory where we can really see meaningful effects.
And what about that? I mean, what about the notion that raising the minimum wage is an effective strategy for poverty reduction?
Yeah, I think there's good evidence supporting that. For example, there has been recent studies which basically showed that, you know, if you increase minimum wage by, say, 10%, poverty reduction takes place by about 2.9% elasticity. So for example, a 10% increase in minimum wage takes about 4.6 million people out of poverty. And I think on that particular issue, there is some agreement on both sides of this debate that, you know, there is agreement that increasing minimum wage does have a positive impact on poverty reduction.
So, we see that as I think for many people, this is a developing world phenomenon. Would you see something similar in the U.S.?
Well, the U.S., you have the problem of the minimum wage being poorly targeted based on where people fall in the income distribution, because a lot of minimum wage workers are not in poor families. They're part of multi-wage families that lie above the poverty line. In many cases, these are teenagers. So you have a wage policy that's being targeted to fight poverty, where a poverty policy might be better equipped to solve the poverty problem, like an earned income tax credit or a tax and a welfare program. So in that sense, to purely have it be sold as an anti-poverty program in the U.S. it doesn't make as much sense as it might in other areas of the world. And in that sense, I think a real debate has to occur about not just, what does the minimum wage signify, but what does it really do to the people it's intended to help? Is it helping us? Yeah, it could help some people. Is it hurting anybody? Who else might it be helping? Who else might it be hurting? And are there any other ways that we can help people other than the minimum wage?
And what are some of those ways?
Basically, if you're talking about minimum wage, yeah, I agree that, in the United States, those who are earning minimum wage, they come from different income strata. It's not, not all of them are coming from poor families. Some come from different families. But still, despite that, increasing minimum wage would have a net positive impact on income distribution, for example, on overall income growth in the economy. So I think it'll have an overall positive impact on the economy.
I would add to that, I would agree that history has bore that out, that I think the erosion of the minimum wage has damaged the U.S. and has led partially to the massive inequality that we have in the U.S. now. And in the long run, we have a level of inequality in the United States that's not sustainable, and the minimum wage could be one tool to lessen that. I would add, though, there are a lot of institutions in the United States that have changed as well, along with the minimum wage, the erosion of unions. The change from the increasing work requirements placed on welfare, the reluctance to expand unemployment insurance, all of those things together help to the power of the minimum wage to perhaps help poor families. In other countries, they have a much stronger social safety net. If somebody loses their job because they can't find one of these minimum wage jobs, there is unemployment insurance that has a higher replacement ratio to help their income. So in the U.S., if we do double the minimum wage, we don't have the rest of the institutions in place to act as a safety net. So in that sense, we have some dangers ahead of us unless we also reform some of these other aspects of our economy that are contributed to our massive inequality.
Well, we're about bumping up against our break, but when we come back, we'd like to talk a little bit about the contrarian view of the reasons not to increase the minimum wage. But first, we'll take a short break.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking about wages for the world's workers with Scott Adams and Abdur Chowdhury. Well, we've talked a little bit about the benefits that proponents for raising the minimum wage would put on the table, but what about the critics? What about the notion you often hear that, this is a job killer, and it's actually going to have a counter of the desired effect?
I disagree with that view. The reason is, if you remember, every time there is a debate regarding raising minimum wage, we hear this, that minimum wage will kill jobs. When minimum wage was $4, we heard that argument. When minimum wage is $7, we are hearing that argument. When proposal to raise it to 10, we are hearing that argument. But if you look at job creation in the U.S. overall, we have seen increase in jobs. So I don't agree with that minimum wage is going to kill jobs. There may be some redistribution in the job creating area, but overall I think it will have a bigger impact, because with higher wages you'll see higher income, people are going to spend more money, which will create additional jobs in the economy.
And what about primarily in developing economies, the notion that you'll push people into the informal economy, that whereas they could work at a certain wage level in the formal economy, if you compel the employers to raise that, you'll push them sort of off the books?
I don't see much evidence supporting that. You can always come up with that argument, but I really don't see much evidence which supports that notion that people have been moved to the informal sector because of increases in minimum wage.
And so following on that argument that, it actually can benefit the economy, there's this, the notion of sort of the cleansing effect, that by raising the wages that workers get, the less efficient companies and employers are sort of driven out of the market. You hear that, for example, in reference to China a lot. Do you think that, that's a dynamic we see?
Well, I think if there are efficiency gains to be had from raising wages voluntarily, we would see employers raise more of the wages voluntarily. There is some truth to the fact that a higher wage creates what is sometimes called an efficiency wage, where you may prompt the workers to work harder. The issue that enforces an efficiency wage, though, is the unemployment threat that the higher wage floor creates. And this is where Professor Chowdhury and I might diverge a little bit. I do believe that a minimum wage, if it's set high enough, will have disemployment effects. And I think that research that we've seen where minimum wage has hit very high in the income distribution, as we've seen with city living wage legislation, or if we've seen with city minimum wages that have been high already, talking about $14, $15, $16 an hour, we've observed disemployment effects. Now we can argue about the merits of that research, but that research does exist, and I've done some of it, so I do believe it. And I think in that sense, I would worry about a minimum wage that high. I don't know. And then if you are to argue that there would be no disemployment effects, then what are the employers going to do? Are they going to raise prices? Are they going to reallocate labor? Are they going to not train workers? What sort of workers are then going to be attracted to these companies, workers who otherwise would have gone into an apprenticeship or trained and instead go to this higher wage job? I think you have the potential with a minimum wage that high to create some disincentives for human capital investment. And if that's the case, then I worry about the long-term future. Now, would a $15 minimum wage do that? Maybe not, but if we're starting to get in the realm of minimum wages that high, I think we're bumping up against displacing human capital investment, which would worry me. I also think that there are, along with the wages, there are some other unintended consequences of raising a minimum wage this high that we should think about. We should think about whether a minimum wage this high, and other countries have seen this, whether or not this would attract workers from neighboring countries. What sort of complications would that add to a labor market where we're already worried about unemployment? A higher minimum wage puts a lot of disposable income immediately into the hands of young people. They may not use that disposable income wisely if they're the ones that are getting this huge minimum wage increase. So all of these things are arguably parts of the debate that if we raise the minimum wage that high, we have to seriously, and it has such an effect on the economy, we have to think of all of these competing welfare effects.
So is there a sweet spot? If raising it too high is potentially distortionary, how do we come up with where it should be?
Too high, obviously, if it is too high, this will have some distortionary impact. But basically, the type of numbers that are floating around, I think those are quite reasonable in terms of where we'd like to see minimum wage go to.
And we've been talking a lot about the U.S. and $15 an hour, for example. What are the analogs in other places? I mean,
it varies from country to country depending on the cost of living and other things. For example, you saw in Australia it's close to $16, whereas in countries like India, for example, we don't expect that to exceed $1 maybe. So it will vary from. In the developing countries, for example, you might use the notion of the $2 a day criteria that many countries have used. So it will vary from country to country.
So you touched on the phenomena of sort of labor mobility and the attractiveness of the country over the border offering a higher wage. Are there any examples of attempts to sort of regionalize minimum wage? There's something called the Asia floor wage movement, is there not, where in a much larger geographical area the wages would be consistent to try to deal with that sort of thing?
It has been done in a number of regions. You talked about the Asian, but I don't agree to that notion that raising the minimum wage would be attracting people from other countries to flock into those countries. When people come in, other factors attract them. It's not the minimum wage per se. So I think that wouldn't have much impact on immigration.
So what's your response?
I agree with that with the U.S. I think that, but if we're talking about EU countries, and the EU countries are each setting their own minimum wages. Germany is wrestling with this as well, and Germany is a country that has multiple minimum wages that apply to different industries that are negotiated between the works councils and the government. And they worry about attracting people from other EU countries if they set their minimum wage that's out of the realm of their neighbors. I'm thinking more in the U.S. about setting minimum wages in certain sectors or cities that are neighboring other places that don't have minimum wages that are high. I mean, I don't think a minimum wage is going to be the reason that a family is going to pick up and leave Guatemala to travel to the United States. But I do think that if you have massively different institutions in one state compared to another state, that has the potential to cause some people to cross state lines and take advantage of that. And you could have an unemployment problem that would end up being worse if that was the case. So how does the fact that there are now obviously multinational employers factor into this? So essentially the boss writing the check is the same in multiple different markets, and the wages that can be offered can vary wildly.
It can happen, and you can see wages varying across countries because of the cost of living, because of the cultural issues. You can see that happen. Even you look at the Eurozone countries, within the Eurozone countries, you do see variation in wages. If you compare Northern Europe with Southern Europe, you do see a significant difference in wages. So that can happen, despite, the free flow of labor among those countries.
So, you hear of a race to the bottom in terms of the cost of labor. Is there any way of mitigating that? I mean, why, if I'm a manufacturer and I could get reasonably comparable work done somewhere and pay my workers much less, wouldn't I do that?
Sure, but you always have to think about the productivity of labor. The U.S. still has the most productive labor force on the planet. So you get what you pay for. And I haven't seen minimum wage largely been blamed for displacement of jobs overseas. There are issues, there are changes in the nature of production in the U.S. that do shift jobs overseas. We should focus in the United States at things we're relatively better at, which are higher technical production, and some of the jobs necessarily will go overseas, minimum wage or union or not. So in that sense, yes. I don't know if there's a race. There's no race to the bottom. There's a race to find productivity that matches the wage that you're going to pay the workers.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I don't see, the reason industries move from one place to another is productivity is one reason, but it's not the race to the bottom. And
what about in situations here or elsewhere where there are forces that are beyond government, for example, that are actively trying to prevent a rise in the minimum wage, and the prospect of workers organizing is something that is much more problematic. To what extent do we see the ability to collectively bargain trending one way or another around the world?
In recent months, we have seen an increase in workers, uniting both at the national level, also at the international level, talking about, an overall increase in wages. So we do see a positive trend towards workers' movement where, they collectively are trying to raise wages across different countries.
And I think that movement works. I mean, I think if you have workers raising awareness of the fact that inequality is not sustainable, both in these other countries and particularly the U.S., that matters. The ability of retail or fast food workers to organize and bargain with their employer is incredibly difficult because you don't have fast food workers who are bargaining with the headquarters of McDonald's. I mean, they form their employment relationship with the franchise owner, who often is a small business owner that is a middle-class person himself. So this idea of us versus them is oftentimes not in reality in terms of the fast food owner versus the person. I mean, this is a class discussion. These are low-wage workers across industries, and a way too distant top 1%, top 5% that we're trying to have a less wide gap that can hopefully lead to a more cohesive society. And I think that's what this international discussion is helpful for.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Scott Adams, Abdur Chowdhury, thank you as always for joining us. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,